90% of us want to own our own home, but for many, it's now almost impossible.
No one can really afford to buy the entire thing unless you're earning a really good wage.
A government part-buy, part-rent scheme could help.
It does give you that security of your own front door, the ability to decorate your home, things that you cannot do when you're renting.
Shared ownership works for some, but what happens when things go wrong?
The demand is around 4,400. It's obscene.
Would you do it again if you could go back in time?
Absolutely not.
The government's now promising billions to expand the scheme. Tonight on Panorama, the truth about shared ownership.
It's designed to get people onto the property ladder, but it very nearly kicked me off it.
It's a duff product, and it's a duff product which is desperately in need of reform.
This is Southwark in South London, where house prices have more than tripled in 20 years. The average price for a home here is now over £500,000. Hi, Deepa.
Hi, Dashi, come on in.
Oh, thank you. Do you know what? It's a really lovely flat. For like your first home, I can see why you'd be really excited to move in.
I was really happy, especially when, the balcony and the views that I have. I've been working in London for a number of years. I'd saved up a really decent amount of deposit, and I thought, I want my own property, I want my own home. So I'd looked around, I'd realised that I probably can't afford this just through the open market.
In 2010, Deepa's flat was worth £205,000, but with a £15,000 deposit, she could afford to buy 75% under the shared ownership scheme. She pays a mortgage on her share and a subsidised rent on the remaining 25% to her housing association, Peabody. How did you feel when you initially bought it?
Oh, I was really happy. I was thrilled, to think I've done it.
Yeah.
I'm 30 years old. I didn't have to ask anybody for help. It was me, and this was my own.
Deepa's dream was to own the whole flat by purchasing more and more of it from Peabody. This is known as staircasing. Did you want to staircase?
By the time I was ready, I couldn't afford it. The price had jumped, and it was impossible.
The majority of shared owners never buy 100% of their property, and now for Deepa, the costs of living here have shot up. Do you have copies of those bills?
I do, yes. So I've got my service charges for when I moved in.
The service charge covers building upkeep, property insurance, and Deepa's gas bill. Although she only owns a share of her home, she has to pay the full charge. 10 years ago, it was around £1,800 a year.
And the latest
Right.
one shows that I'm paying £3,257. It's a huge jump.
You're paying over £3,000 a year?
Yes.
Just for service charges?
That's correct, and no extra service.
It's an estimated charge which she has to pay up front. But she and her husband have been struggling financially since the pandemic. She's now on universal credit. How easy do you find it to pay these extra charges?
I don't. I can't pay it. And I have, it's embarrassing to say, but I have amassed a lot of arrears because I cannot pay it.
Professor David Cowan has studied the shared ownership model for 20 years.
There are people for whom shared ownership is a good thing, but there are a lot of shared owners out there who are in financial misery as a result of these high service charges. I think the thing that we must always remember about shared owners, as opposed to ordinary homeowners, if I can put it like that, is that shared owners are, by their nature, at the more financially vulnerable end of the spectrum.
Peabody said service charges are recovered for costs incurred and do not generate income, and they have teams to support people who may be struggling financially. Shared ownership has been around since the 70s.
What's impressed you most about the new idea?
The repayments, whereas if we bought a house normally, it'd be too much for us.
As house prices rocketed, shared ownership grew too.
The shared ownership scheme enabled them to find the house they wanted and own part of it. Mark and Alison can't believe their luck.
When you're in your own house, you just do what you want. You leave dirty socks everywhere and don't make your bed. It's great, it really is.
The number of shared ownership homes built in England each year has almost doubled since 2016. In England alone, there are now over 150,000 shared ownership properties. Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland all have their own versions. Chris Worrell lives in Bromley by Bow, East London.
I was elated, really. You know, it takes your breath away when you sort of first come up here. Stuff you dream of, really, when you're sort of thinking if you're going to get a flat, you're going to have a nice view, don't you?
In 2016, he bought a 30% share of his 3-bedroom flat. The full value was £475,000. On top of his mortgage, this year, Chris is paying over £10,000 in rent to his housing association, Clarion.
Yeah, so this is what we saw when we come in.
It's a beautiful flat.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Chris works in property himself and is involved in the Labour Party.
You know, my mum's always said you've got to get your foot on the housing ladder. You know, it seemed at the time really, exciting and an achievable thing to do.
Like Deepa, Chris is now in arrears. When he moved in 4 years ago, his service charge was almost £2,300 a year.
This year, the demand is around 4,400, so double, almost.
And this is something that you had no idea you'd be facing when you came in?
No, not increases at this rate. It's obscene.
Clarion told Chris that in recent years they had underestimated the service charge. He now has to pay thousands of pounds in back payments, as well as this year's increased charge. He's refusing to pay while he goes through a complaints process.
It's really difficult to know where you are at any point because their communication's just so poor. They're not really interested. They keep want to knock it into the next phase, dragging it out, promising information. And they just wait for people to tire, you know.
Clarion told Panorama that Chris's service charge includes increased concierge costs and is in line with similar buildings. They say all residents were given a year to pay the balance. But are these service charges justifiable on supposedly affordable homes? I'm on my way to talk to Kate Henderson, who represents housing associations in England. We've talked to shared ownership tenants who've gone into the scheme because they've been told their service charge was a certain amount, and yet that has doubled within just a number of years. How can that be justified as reasonable or affordable?
As not-for-profit housing associations, there is no profit from the service charge. It's purely to cover the cost of services.
These people say that their so-called affordable home is no longer affordable. What do you say to that?
I think it's really important that when a home is sold that has a service charge attached to it, that it's really clearly communicated that what it covers and that it could go up and that it could go down. In terms of shared owners specifically, we do know that the majority, it's around 60%, report having a good experience.
Okay, but 40% don't have a good experience with their housing association then, by your admission?
The majority, so around 60% do have a good experience. We would like that number to be higher.
In fact, the survey found 21% of shared owners were dissatisfied with their housing association. And it's not just because of service charges. Many shared ownership homes are new builds, and that can bring its own problems. It's something Julia Travato knows a lot about. She bought a flat here in Hoxton, East London in 2007.
So what is this? This is the basement?
Absolutely. This is the basement where from time to time the pipes would burst. So as you can see, this is the video that I took.
So that's actual sewage water?
Absolutely. So
that's actual toilet roll or tissue that's coming through the broken pipe?
It could be any kind of things.
Julia bought a 45% share of her 3-bedroom property. The total value of the flat was £295,000. She pays rent to our housing association, L&Q. Soon after she moved in, she realised there were problems with the building.
I mean, what did they say when you would call them up and say, our basement is flooded with literal sewage?
Some answers were really ridiculous, like, can you use some gaffer tape and,
Gaffer tape to what?
To just seal the patch which has burst or the crack, or some of them were like, okay, but we cannot do anything until Monday.
Leaks from poorly fitted pipes caused damp and mould in Julia's ground floor flat. L&Q agreed to the repairs, which took 6 months to complete.
So what happened next?
We receive, obviously, notice of future rent and service charges. We see something a little bit bizarre, something like £3,000 per month just for service charges.
And what had your service charge been before?
Always in the region, I'll say 150 to 200 at the most.
So your service charge went up from £150, £200 per month to £3,000 per month?
Yeah. Yeah, unbelievable, right?
Quite a lot of shared owners are finding that there are structural problems, build defects with their buildings, particularly new builds. The trouble is that for shared owners, their rights are very, very limited.
So ultimately, they could still end up having to pay these costs, even though they only own a fraction of the property.
That's what they're obligated to pay, and really, there's no way around that.
How much do you think you should pay for the repairs?
I bought this flat convinced that it was structurally sound, and with the flat, the whole building. So to be confronted with a bill for 100% of the repair works, I don't think it's fair. And at the very, very most, I should be paying my share, not 100%, like they are insisting I should pay. No.
Julia owes over £20,000 to L&Q for the repairs. L&Q told Panorama that given the benefits of the scheme, it is fair and reasonable for shared owners to pay for repairs. And they said they will continue to explore repayment options with Julia. In September, the government announced £12 billion of investment in affordable housing, including a new reformed shared ownership scheme. In the current scheme, new shared owners have to buy at least 25% of their property to start with. But the government want to reduce that to just 10%.
I think if you lower the stakes to get in, then you are talking about people on potentially lower incomes than are now required. They will be, almost by definition, the people who are potentially most sort of economically fragile, and that bears risks for them.
Under the new scheme, the government wants housing associations to pay for the first 10 years of repairs. But this won't help current shared owners, like Julia.
Can you afford to pay £3,000 a month in service charges and repair costs?
Absolutely not. That is more than our, salaries put together. If I had some younger couple coming to me and saying we would like to go into shared ownership, I would say, you know what, better eat bread and drink water for several years and put money aside, rather than, having to face what we faced.
The government told Panorama the new shared ownership model will be fairer and would help more people across the country realise their dream of owning their home. For some, shared ownership is a way to stay living and working in the area they grew up in. I'm in the Cotswolds, where the average home costs over £400,000, well above the national average. Kelly Reynolds grew up here and works as a manager in a hotel. She bought 50% of her property for £50,000 12 years ago.
I was a single person with just one wage. I couldn't afford to purchase outright. If I hadn't have gone into shared ownership, I would have just been renting. And this seemed a way to sort of break into the housing market. It seemed like a fantastic scheme.
Her problem started when she tried to sell her home last year.
I received a message from my buyers to say they were having difficulty finding a lender that would loan them the mortgage amount because of the remaining length of term of the lease, which at that point was 67 years. And they asked me if I would consider extending the lease. And the buyers had explained that if I didn't extend the lease, they wouldn't be able to proceed with the sale.
Like Kelly, nearly all shared owners are leaseholders. They only own their home for the duration of the lease. Once the lease is under 80 years, it can be difficult to sell and very expensive to extend.
I'd never heard of having to extend a lease before, so I contacted the Housing Association, which was the Guinness Partnership, to inquire how I might go about doing that.
She had to pay £12,800 to extend her lease, plus an administration charge, their legal fees, and her own.
In total, you're talking best part of £15,000 to £16,000. Well, I didn't have that kind of money sat in a savings account. When you take off the lease premium plus all the fees I had to pay, I actually came out with, I think, around £5,000 less than what I actually bought it for 11 years previously.
Even though the value of Kelly's property had increased, extending her lease meant she ended up losing money.
Well, some people would say you were sold a short lease and you possibly should have, found out more about it before you bought. What would you say to that?
Well, I don't really think that I understood that I was buying a short lease. I would have expected that to be pointed out to me and explained to me.
By who?
Well, by the Housing Association. They passed the blame onto my solicitor and took no responsibility themselves. Guinness and other housing associations, they do have a duty of care to their customers, and I think there should be more transparency.
The Guinness Partnership told Panorama that the cost of Kelly's lease extension was determined by an independent valuer. They said, as a charitable housing provider, we reinvest the proceeds of any sale to produce more homes to meet this country's housing need. I wanted to speak to Kelly's neighbours, who are also in shared ownership homes run by Guinness.
Hi, I'm a reporter for BBC Panorama. When did you buy this shared ownership?
None of the people I spoke to were aware of the problems with short leases when they bought their home.
Thank you very much for speaking to me. It does feel like a lot of people have been kept in the dark about their lease length and what it means. And I think Guinness have a lot of questions to answer.
In law, we define shared ownership as a social housing product, and we should never forget that. So if you're asking me whether a social landlord should be telling their shared owners that their lease is going below a certain period, then I would hope that they would.
When we asked Guinness how many of their shared ownership homes across the country had leases under 80 years, they told us 1,500. If all of these were to be extended at the average price, we estimate Guinness could receive more than £20 million. Guinness said Panorama's investigations have drawn attention to the fact that not all property owners are aware of the implications of decreasing lease terms, and said that they will now be writing to all their shared owners highlighting this.
We are now approaching Battersea Park.
Even when housing associations can give shared owners a long lease, they don't always do so. These swanky flats in South London are being sold by Clarion, the UK's largest housing association. But we've discovered that Clarion bought these flats last year from a developer with a 999-year lease. They're now being sold to shared owners with a 125-year lease. The question is, why are they doing that?
I can't see any reason in law why they couldn't give, let's say, a 200, 300, 999-year lease. As long as they've got a long lease themselves or they own the freehold, they could give any length of lease they like.
What would be the benefit in not offering a very long lease to a shared owner?
There is a price to extend your lease. So there is a sort of income stream that comes with shorter leases.
Clarion said they are a charitable registered society and don't exist to make profits. They told us the 125-year lease is in line with the government rules. The government told us it expects a 99-year minimum lease term, but it was up to providers to decide. When a housing association can grant a shared ownership property a 999-year lease, should they be doing that?
At the moment, a shared ownership new build property would go with a traditional lease length, 125 years. I think at the moment they're following current leasehold kind of rules and practice.
But there are no current leasehold rules and practice that say you have to offer 125 years. You can offer 999 years on a leasehold property.
In terms of the overall length of leases that housing associations individually decide to opt for, I think that's for individual housing associations to work through.
So it just seems strange to me why they wouldn't want to pass on 999 years to a shared ownership person who is in that scheme because it's meant to be affordable.
I can't comment at this stage on behalf of the sector, but I think the ability to extend lease lengths at the beginning, to have longer leases, would be a positive thing for the consumer.
But for now, many of the shared owners we've spoken to feel anything but positive. What was sold to them as affordable housing has become unaffordable, while their housing associations derive an income from the scheme. We've been through the profits of 3 of the housing associations that provide the most shared ownership homes, and they get over £140 million in profit through shared ownership sales and the rent generated from those shared ownership homes. That seems like quite a hefty amount.
So housing associations are not for profit, but we do operate as a sector to generate a surplus. That surplus then gets reinvested in the upkeep of existing homes. We have a desperate housing crisis. We need 90,000 social rented homes each year. So it's really important that we do generate income to invest in the building of new social and affordable homes as well.
A month after we last met, I'm back to visit Chris in East London. He's had some news about the service charges he's challenging. How's it going?
Yeah, not bad, but had been better. Had a bit of an update from Clarion. They're sending threats of, for them considering to serve a notice of seeking possession.
Why do you think they're threatening to take legal action and possess your home whilst you're in the middle of a complaints process with them?
It's the only thing I can think of is that it's just bullying and intimidation. They're trying to scare people into paying the service charge. We've had some of my neighbours who have received similar letters and they've paid it out of fear.
Clarion said repossessing someone's home is a last resort and they will always discuss a tailored repayment plan. So it's been 3 weeks since I saw Chris and Clarion have been in touch. They've told him that they're not upholding his complaint and that it's now closed. They have offered him £50 in compensation though for the time taken, which they say they will offset against the £3,000 he still owes them. He's still waiting to see whether they will carry out their repossession threat. It's rare for shared owners to be repossessed, but it can happen. And if it does, you can lose everything, including your deposit and any equity.
If you have the flat on a shared ownership tenancy, it's actually a lot easier to lose the flat than it is if you bought it outright with a mortgage, say. They could potentially lose everything. If a possession order is made, that ends their entitlement to the flat, it ends their entitlement to the money they paid for it. They would get nothing back, potentially.
Back in South London, Deepa is still struggling with a home she can no longer afford.
I still have to pay all this money, and I've got nothing to pay it with. I don't really know what to do.
Since buying her property 10 years ago through Peabody, Deepa's started a family.
Do you want Mummy to play? Yeah! Oh, I see, you've got a little smiley face here.
Deepa and her husband Greg now have 3 young children crammed into a 2-bedroom flat.
I can't afford it. It's as simple as that, and I can't sell, so I'm stuck.
That's because there's another problem. Since the Grenfell tragedy, thousands of buildings across the country have had to be tested for fire safety. Residents like Deepa can't sell their flats until they have certificates proving they're safe.
Peabody have said to us through a blanket letter that it's going to take a number of years. We are effectively trapped because until we have that certification, a lender is not going to lend to our buyer. So we can't even start a selling process.
Deepa's family is desperate to move outside London to a bigger and cheaper place.
But that next step is far away right now. I don't know how many years it's going to take. I never imagined my children growing up as teenagers in this place, but it's looking more and more likely, and upsettingly likely.
Her last hope is to sublet the property and rent elsewhere. But she needs her mortgage provider's permission, and she's still waiting to hear from them. Until she sells, her money is tied up in the flat.
I've trapped us. A decision that I made based on information that I was given and how things were sold to me as being affordable has now turned into the worst, the absolute worst thing I could have ever done. I've put everything into this place, all my money, everything I had. I'm stuck.
Oh, I'm really sorry. Peabody told Panorama that they have employed a team of experts to carry out the investigations needed for a safety certificate to be issued. The government said it was unacceptable that some homeowners are stuck in limbo, and it was working to resolve the issue. In a housing market that prices out so many of us, shared ownership is seen as a way to give those on lower incomes a leg onto the property ladder and to boost home ownership. But at what cost?
A broken barrow that belonged to the Banana King. Bunches of expertise required in brand new The Repair Shop next. Then at 9 on BBC One, it's all about risk and reward. But when it comes to shelling scallops, it's tough even for those MasterChef professionals.